I had always thought vacations were supposed to be moments of escape, a brief break from the grind. But as I stood alone in the terminal, dragging my bag behind me, I realized how wrong I was. My son had vanished somewhere between the ticket counter and the gate, leaving me with a stack of receipts and a sinking feeling in my chest. I could still hear the echoes of his laughter from earlier, that bright, teasing tone, the same one that now felt sharp with greed. He hadn't wanted to see the airport or the planes. He just wanted me to pay. Everything, from the overpriced snacks to the tickets for the small carousel ride. I looked around, the crowd moving in waves, families rushing past with their luggage, couples holding hands, and I felt the sting of invisibility. The scent of coffee and sanitizer hung thick in the air, clashing with the distant whiff of airplane fuel through the open doors. I rubbed my temples, trying to keep calm. My phone buzzed, but it was just another reminder that I was alone, that he was somewhere ahead, thinking of the next thing he could make me buy. The loudspeaker crackled, calling for the final boarding of my flight. Panic surged, cold and sharp. I sprinted to the gate, my suitcase bouncing behind me, heart hammering in my ears. The line was gone. Only the flight attendants remained, shaking their heads. I had been left behind, alone. And for the first time in years, the truth hit me harder than any disappointment ever could. This wasn't about the vacation. This was about him, my son, the one I loved, the one who had made it clear with every demand that he only cared about what I could give him. I sank onto a bench, the scratch of the metal against my jeans a harsh reminder of reality. I could feel my jaw tighten, taste the bitterness of both coffee and regret. I thought of all the other times I had quietly paid for everything, the subtle toll it had taken on my patience, on my dignity. Now, with the roar of planes overhead and the blur of travelers rushing past, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Anger, not just at him, but at myself for letting it get this far. And in that moment, a decision formed, slow and deliberate, like the distant rumble of an approaching storm. I wasn't going to be left behind again, not just at the airport, but in life. I didn't chase him. I didn't call. Instead, I stayed on that bench, letting the airport buzz wash over me like a cold, indifferent tide. My heart was still racing, but the anger had settled into a quiet, burning focus. I watched families reunite at the gates, hugs and laughter flashing around me, and a strange clarity hit. I wasn't just left behind at the airport. I had been left behind by the version of my son I thought I knew. I finally pulled out my phone and scrolled through the chain of messages he had left while I tried to keep up with his demands. "Dad, get this. Buy me that. Hurry up." Each one was a small barb, each one a reminder that our relationship had become transactional, a ledger of favors and payments instead of memories. I clenched my fist around the phone, nails biting into my palm. Then I noticed a young woman nearby, her backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder, eating a bag of chips while scrolling through her own phone. I envied her oblivion. She wasn't worrying about anyone else, hadn't been dragged into a game of manipulation disguised as a vacation. The comparison stung. I finally stood up, pulling my bag closer. I wasn't going to let this ruin me. Not today. I had a decision to make. I could let this break me, or I could turn it into the moment that defined me. And I knew exactly what I needed. Space from him, from the demands, from the old patterns. I walked toward the information desk and asked for the next flight out. Not back home, not chasing him, but forward. The clerk looked at me skeptically, but I didn't care. I could taste freedom in the airport coffee, smell it in the recycled air, hear it in the distant engines. For the first time, I felt like I was acting for myself, not just for him. Somewhere between the check-in counter and the gate, I realized that being left behind wasn't a failure. It was a wake-up call, and this time, I was ready to answer it. By the time I landed in the next city, my anger had sharpened into something precise, almost surgical. I didn't know exactly how I would confront him yet, but I knew the moment had to come. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about respect, boundaries, and finally being seen. I rented a small car and drove through streets lined with palm trees and sun-baked buildings, the hum of the engine under me a steady heartbeat. My mind replayed the flight, the bench, the hollow ache of being left behind. Every detail was etched: the metallic scrape of my suitcase, the faint sweetness of an abandoned pretzel, the distant chatter of other families. I could almost feel him laughing somewhere, thinking it was a joke. When I reached the hotel where he was staying, I hesitated only for a moment. The lobby smelled of waxed floors and citrus cleaner. He wasn't expecting me. That was the advantage. I found him lounging by the pool, phone in hand, sunglasses perched on his nose like a shield. He didn't notice me at first, and that made me pause. I let the silence stretch, letting the tension build until it was almost unbearable. When he finally looked up, his smile faltered. "Dad? What? How?" I held up my hand, cutting him off. "We need to talk," I said. My voice was calm, but every word carried weight. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I just stood there, letting him feel the gravity of being caught in the moment. The imbalance he had created finally staring back at him. He tried to joke, to deflect, but I didn't move. The sun hit his face, making the beads of sweat on his forehead shine. I could see the first flicker of something real, unease. And it was enough. I realized then that confrontation wasn't about anger. It was about truth. And the truth was this: I had limits, I had worth, and I would no longer be the silent ATM he expected. I didn't let him talk for long. He kept trying to joke, his laugh bouncing off the poolside tiles like it meant nothing. But I stayed silent, watching him squirm under the heat of my gaze. The sun reflected off the water, shimmering across the pool like shards of light, and I realized I could see every nuance of his expression: the twitch of his mouth, the rise of his eyebrows, the hesitation in his stance. I had spent years giving him the benefit of the doubt, paying without protest, smoothing over fights with a smile. But not this time. "Look," I said finally, my voice low and steady, "I'm done paying for everything. Done being your convenience. Done being invisible when it suits you." He opened his mouth, trying to cut in, but I raised a hand. "Don't. I've been quiet too long. You think this is just about money, but it's not. It's about respect. It's about understanding that I have limits, and that I'm more than just a wallet or a chauffeur." I could feel the tension tighten in his shoulders. For a moment I thought he might storm off, retreat into the comfort of his phone or the poolside chair, but something in the way he looked at me, something unsettled, made me hold my ground. I stepped closer, letting the sun warm my face, letting the sound of the water lap against the edges of the pool underscore my words. "You left me at the airport," I continued, letting the words land like stones in a quiet pond. "You thought it was funny. That's not funny. That's hurtful. And it's selfish. I've been bending over backward for you for years, and what do I get in return? Nothing but expectations that I'll always pay, always give, always forgive." For a moment he just stared. I could see the conflict flashing in his eyes, the fight between amusement and guilt. He opened his mouth again, but I cut him off. "This isn't about arguing. It's about me telling you, me showing you, that things change now, that I am done being taken for granted." The air felt heavier, the sun hotter, the distant chatter of other tourists fading into background noise. I realized I was trembling slightly, not from anger, but from the intensity of finally saying what I had buried for so long. My fists were clenched at my sides, but not from rage. This was control. Finally grasped, finally wielded. He finally spoke, voice low and uncertain. "Dad, I didn't mean—" "I know you didn't," I interrupted softly. "And that's exactly the problem. You don't think. You take. You assume. And I'm done letting that slide. You're going to start seeing me, not just what I provide, but who I am. And if that means you don't like it, then you'll have to get used to it." The words hung in the air like smoke. I could feel him searching for a retort, for a joke to cut the tension, but none came. For the first time, I wasn't just talking at him. I was reaching him, piercing through the armor of entitlement he had built. Finally, he lowered his gaze, a shift in posture that betrayed more than any words could. The defiance was fading, replaced by a flicker of recognition, maybe even remorse. And for the first time, I allowed myself a small, private sense of victory. Not in humiliation, but in clarity. He had seen me. He had truly seen me. And the dynamic between us had changed forever. After that day by the pool, things didn't magically become perfect. Change, I learned, was never immediate. It crept in, subtle and often frustrating. I could see it in him, though, in the way he hesitated before asking for something, in the way he looked for permission instead of assuming I'd pay. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was reclaiming my role, not as a provider who was endlessly used, but as a father with boundaries, a man with dignity. The next morning, I took a walk along the quiet streets of the city, the pavement warm beneath my shoes. The sun was high, scattering light across the colorful storefronts, and the scent of fresh coffee from a nearby cafe mingled with the salt air drifting from the nearby harbor. Each step was deliberate. I wanted to feel grounded, connected to something beyond the drama of the previous day. And in that rhythm, I started thinking about my own life, how much I had deferred to his wants, how much of myself I had hidden to keep the peace. When I returned to the hotel, I found him sitting on the balcony, phone in hand. But this time he wasn't laughing, wasn't demanding. He looked almost tentative, like he was stepping carefully onto new ground. "Dad, can we talk?" he said quietly, the words almost foreign to my ears. I nodded and sat across from him. "Sure," I said, keeping my tone calm but firm. I know I've been selfish," he started, fumbling over the words. "I didn't realize how much I was taking from you. I thought you wanted to do all of this for me, and I held up my hand. "Stop," I said gently. "You don't need to justify yourself. I just need you to understand that things have to change. I'm not just going to hand everything over anymore. I'm not going to let you measure me by what I provide." He nodded slowly, chewing on the words. "Okay," he said finally. "I get it. I'll try to do better." There was no bravado in his voice, no deflection, just honesty. And it hit me harder than any argument we had ever had. We spent the rest of the day walking through the city together, not chasing activities or souvenirs, but just moving side by side, talking in quiet fragments. I noticed things I had missed before. The way he looked at the street performers with genuine curiosity. The way he paused to smell flowers in a small park. The way he laughed without trying to pull something from me. Each moment was a reminder that he could be more than his entitled habits, that I could be more than the man he had reduced me to. That night, as we sat in the hotel room watching the city lights blink through the windows, I felt a deep sense of relief. The tension between us had eased, replaced by something fragile but real. Respect. It wasn't perfect, and I knew there would be setbacks. But for the first time, I felt like I wasn't fighting a losing battle. I had drawn a line, and he had acknowledged it. I fell asleep that night with a sense of quiet victory. The kind that isn't loud or boastful, but steady. The kind that roots itself in the knowledge that you've finally claimed your place in your own story. And in that, I realized something vital. Being left behind at the airport hadn't been a failure. It had been a wake-up call, a turning point that made me confront not just him, but myself. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The next morning, I woke to a text from him. "Want to check out the market today?" Simple, unassuming. No demands, no strings attached. I felt a small surge of pride. He was initiating something, not expecting me to fund it or solve it. I got dressed and met him in the hotel lobby, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel drained by anticipation. I felt curious. The market was alive with color and chaos. Stalls overflowed with fresh fruit, handmade crafts, the scent of roasted nuts mingling with the tang of spices. Children laughed, dogs barked, and the occasional shout of a vendor cutting through the air reminded me that life moved fast, whether I wanted it to or not. He followed me closely, occasionally glancing at me with a tentative smile, as if testing whether I would tolerate the new version of him. We wandered past a stall selling intricate glass figurines. He stopped, picked one up, and held it carefully in his hands. "These are amazing," he said, almost whispering. I could hear the awe in his voice, a wonder that wasn't tied to possession or payment. I nodded. "Yeah, they take a lot of skill to make." We moved along, tasting small bites from the food stalls, laughing at the ridiculousness of some street performers, and for a while, it felt like nothing existed beyond the present. The sun warmed our backs, the sounds of the market wrapped around us like a blanket, and I realized how long it had been since I had shared a simple experience with him that didn't involve obligation or frustration. But life doesn't pause for reflection. A group of kids ran past, bumping into him and knocking his phone to the ground. He caught it quickly, but the panic in his eyes was immediate. I could feel the old tension flare, the instinct to fix, to pay, to bail him out. But I held back, letting him take control of the situation. "Dad, he started. "Take it slow," I said, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder. "You've got this." He took a breath, checked the screen, and realized it wasn't cracked. Relief washed over him. But I could see something else too. Pride, a recognition that he had handled it himself. And in that moment, the dynamic between us shifted again, subtly but unmistakably. I wasn't just watching him grow, I was watching him step into responsibility. Later, as we sat on a bench eating pastries, he finally said something that hit me harder than any argument could have. "Dad, I know I've taken a lot from you over the years. I don't want to anymore. I want to be better. For you. For me." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. I didn't respond immediately. I just looked at him. Really looked, seeing the man he could become. The man I had always hoped he could be. And for the first time I realized that my own growth mattered just as much as his. I wasn't just teaching him. I was reclaiming myself. By the time we left the market, carrying small bags of food and trinkets, I felt a quiet sense of triumph. Not the triumph of a parent dominating a child, but the quiet, steady victory of boundaries respected, lessons learned, and a bond that was finally real. The airport, the demands, the humiliation, they were all behind me. Ahead of me was something far more valuable, a relationship built on understanding, respect, and shared experiences rather than obligation. As we walked back to the car, the sun dipping toward the horizon, I felt the warmth of the day lingering on my skin, a reminder that change was possible, even when it seemed impossible before. And for the first time in a long while, I smiled without restraint, knowing that we were finally moving forward together. The next day started calm, almost deceptively so. We had planned to visit a nearby nature trail, a quiet escape from the city's chaos. The air was cooler here, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Birds chirped overhead, and the rustle of leaves underfoot gave the trail a sense of hidden life. I could feel the difference immediately. No phones demanding attention, no petty requests, just space to breathe and move. He seemed tentative at first, walking a few steps behind me, glancing around like he wasn't sure he belonged. I kept my pace slow, letting him adjust. It wasn't just about physical space, it was about emotional space too, giving him room to engage without pressure. And for a while, it worked. He laughed at a squirrel darting across the path, paused to watch a butterfly settle on a fern, and even helped me navigate a tricky section of roots and rocks. Then it happened. Out of nowhere, a group of hikers appeared, loud and careless, pushing past us without acknowledgement. One of them, a young man in his 20s, bumped into him, spilling his water and laughing. My instinct was immediate. I wanted to step in, demand an apology, fix it, but I froze, remembering the progress we had made. This was a test, not for me, but for him. He stood there for a moment, stunned, the water dripping down his arm. I watched him, tense, expecting either a retreat or an angry outburst. But then something shifted. He squared his shoulders, took a deep breath, and said firmly, "Hey, watch it." His voice was clear, controlled, and for the first time it wasn't for me, it was for himself. The young man smirked, muttered something under his breath, and walked away. My son didn't chase him or argue. He just wiped his hand and continued along the trail. I felt a jolt of pride so strong it almost surprised me. He had handled it, alone, without me stepping in, without me rescuing him. We continued walking, the tension gradually fading. He started talking about small things, school, friends, even a joke he had heard recently. It was ordinary conversation, but it carried weight. Each word was a step away from entitlement, a step toward responsibility, a step toward seeing me as a partner in his life, rather than a perpetual provider. By the time we reached a small clearing with a view of the valley below, I realized something vital. The lessons weren't in the lectures, or even in the confrontations. They were in these moments, lived in real time, tested by the unexpected. He was learning, not because I told him to, but because he needed to, because he wanted to. We sat on a fallen log, watching the sun filter through the trees, painting the valley in shades of gold and green. I could feel the tension of the past days slipping away, replaced by a quiet, steady connection. I reached into my bag and pulled out the trail snacks I had packed, granola bars and fruit, and offered him one. He took it without asking for more, without complaint, just gratitude. That small gesture, so simple, felt monumental. "Thanks, Dad," he said softly. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the horizon. Words weren't necessary. The trust, respect, and understanding between us were louder than any sentence could be. As we started back down the trail, I realized that this trip, what had begun as a lesson in boundaries and confrontation, was transforming into something deeper. It wasn't about paying for things or being left behind at an airport. It was about guiding him, shaping him, yes, but also about reclaiming myself, rediscovering my patience, and finding a version of our relationship that neither of us had known existed. By the time we returned to the car, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the path. I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not the flashy kind, but the kind that roots itself quietly in your chest. Progress wasn't perfect, but it was real. And this time, I knew we could build on it. The next morning, I woke to the hum of the air conditioner and the muted bustle of the hotel. The city outside was already alive, with car horns, footsteps, and the faint scent of breakfast wafting up from the streets. I felt rested but alert, knowing that today would test the fragile trust we'd been building. We had planned to take a ferry to a nearby island, a short ride that promised views of the skyline and open water. He was unusually quiet as we walked to the dock, the straps of his backpack digging into his shoulders. I could sense him thinking, hesitant, wary, maybe even anxious. This was the first real challenge for him outside the controlled environment of the market and the trail. On the ferry, you couldn't control what happened. You couldn't rewind. You couldn't pause. The boat rocked gently on the water as we boarded, the scent of salt sharp and clean in my nostrils. The wind tugged at my shirt, the sound of waves lapping against the hull steady and rhythmic. I watched him scan the deck, hands gripping the railing, eyes wide but curious. For a moment I felt a flash of pride just seeing him stand there without clinging to me or complaining. He was claiming his space. Then it happened. A crew member approached, explaining that the ferry had limited seating and that some passengers would need to stand. He glanced at us, then looked directly at my son. "You two can either sit together in the back, or you can separate. Some of the seats are first come, first served." I could see the gears turning in his head. In the past, he might have panicked, whining for me to do something, to demand, to secure the best option. But this time, I stayed quiet, letting him navigate it. I watched him take a deep breath, glance at the scattered seating, and make a decision. "Let's split up," he said, pointing to a couple of empty seats closer to the front. I raised an eyebrow but nodded. "All right, I'll see you at the island." He hesitated, then offered a small, almost sheepish smile. "Thanks for letting me decide." That moment hit me harder than any confrontation ever had. This wasn't about obedience or rules. It was about trust. It was about him stepping into responsibility and realizing that the choices we make, even small ones, carry weight. I felt my chest tighten with a mix of relief and pride. Sitting separately, I let my gaze wander across the water. The sun sparkled off the surface, the occasional seagull dipping low to catch a fish, the distant outline of the island hazy but inviting. I thought about how far we'd come, from the airport, the demands, the arguments, to this quiet moment of independence. Every challenge, every test, had been a step towards something more profound than I had imagined. Mutual respect. When he returned to my side later on the ferry ride, I noticed subtle differences in his posture, the way he held himself. He was calmer, more assured, carrying a sense of ownership over his actions. He didn't need my intervention. He hadn't asked for it. I realized then that the lessons weren't in lectures or ultimatums. They were in experiences, in moments where he had to choose between entitlement and responsibility, in moments where he had to see the consequences of his own decisions. By the time we disembarked, the sun was high, casting long shadows across the dock. The island was alive with tourists, cyclists, and street performers. He moved beside me without hesitation, occasionally pointing out something that caught his interest: a painted mural, a local snack stand, a family of ducks paddling near the shore. For the first time, I felt we were equal participants in an adventure, not a dynamic of provider and taker. Later, we found a quiet bench overlooking the water. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few dollars. "I got this," he said, handing it to me for a snack we both wanted. I could feel the weight of the gesture. It wasn't the money itself, but the acknowledgement that he could contribute, that he understood value and effort. I smiled, the sound of waves filling the space between us. "You've changed," I said softly, almost to myself. He looked down, then back at me, eyes meeting mine without deflection or defensiveness. "I'm trying," he said honestly, and that was enough. The ferry, the market, the trail, they had been tests, each one a subtle but real opportunity for him to see beyond entitlement. Now he was starting to step into responsibility willingly, not because I demanded it, but because he realized what it meant. As we watched the sun begin its descent behind the island, painting the water in shades of orange and gold, I felt a profound sense of closure and anticipation. This vacation had started with frustration, with anger, with the sting of being left behind, but it was ending with growth, trust, and the quiet victories that mattered far more than any purchase or favor. I had not just reclaimed myself, I had helped him begin to reclaim himself too. And for the first time in years, I knew that when we returned home, we wouldn't just be leaving the island. We would be leaving behind the old patterns, stepping forward into a new way of being together. The next morning, the sky was overcast, the clouds heavy and gray, pressing down on the city like a reminder that life didn't always come with bright, easy days. We were scheduled to visit a small museum, a place filled with history, art, and the kind of quiet observation that forced you to slow down. I thought it would be a good test, not of money, not of patience, but of focus and self-control. We walked in, the air cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of aged wood and dust, a smell that somehow felt alive. Visitors moved silently through the halls, whispering to each other, eyes glued to exhibits behind glass. I could feel tension building in him, small but noticeable. The urge to fidget, to check his phone, to complain about what he didn't find immediately interesting. I kept my pace steady, my voice soft but firm, letting him adjust. The first exhibit was about early aviation. Models of planes hung from the ceiling, miniature engines glinting under the soft lighting. He paused, eyes widening as he traced the lines of a tiny propeller with his finger, careful not to touch the glass. For a moment he seemed lost in the story of flight, the triumph and risk captured in each delicate model. I watched him silently, letting the moment sink in. Then came the test. A young couple passed us quickly, laughing loudly, bumping into him. Instinctively, I felt my shoulders tighten, ready to intervene, ready to step in as I always had. But I stopped. I took a breath and looked at him. This was his moment. He froze for a heartbeat, but instead of stepping back or getting upset, he squared his shoulders. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm, and the couple barely noticed before moving on. No argument, no drama, no panicked text to me. He handled it alone. My chest swelled with pride in a way that surprised me. This wasn't just progress, it was transformation in action. We moved to the next exhibit, a collection of paintings from local artists. He lingered over one, a chaotic swirl of color that made him frown. "I don't get it," he admitted. I smiled. "You don't have to. That's part of art. It's about feeling, not understanding everything." He nodded slowly, taking a deep breath as he leaned closer to examine the brushstrokes. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was a shift. Instead of rushing through, he was taking time to see, to feel, to process without complaint. The quiet pride I felt in that moment was almost overwhelming. By midday, we were sitting in the museum cafe, the smell of brewed coffee and pastries mingling with the faint hint of linoleum and paper. He reached into his wallet and offered to pay for our drinks. I hesitated, then nodded, letting him. The gesture was small, but the symbolism was enormous. He was choosing to contribute, to participate actively rather than passively consuming. "Thanks," I said, my voice soft but sincere. He shrugged, a small, self-conscious smile crossing his face. "I mean it, Dad. I'm trying, really trying." And I could see it. Not perfection, not immediate change, but effort, responsibility, awareness. He had moved beyond entitlement into self-reflection, and every small action reinforced it. The real test came near the end of the day. As we exited the museum, the clouds finally broke, releasing a sudden downpour. Tourists scattered, umbrellas snapping open, wet clothes sticking to skin. A puddle sent a small wave toward him as he stepped around it, and he nearly stumbled. Without thinking, I reached out, but he caught himself, steadying without my help. He looked at me, drenched but smiling sheepishly. "Guess I don't need you for everything," he said lightly. I nodded, laughing softly, the sound of raindrops around us blending with the relief in my chest. We walked back to the hotel slowly, drenched but unbothered, sharing quiet conversation about what we had seen and experienced. It struck me how much had changed in just a few days. From the airport debacle to this moment, a journey of patience, respect, and self-awareness. He wasn't perfect, but he was present, and for the first time I didn't feel like a caretaker being drained by his constant demands. That night, as we dried off and prepared for dinner, I realized that the transformation wasn't just his. It was mine too. I had learned restraint, the power of letting go, and the strength in boundaries. Our relationship had shifted in subtle, profound ways. And while the storm outside reminded us that challenges were never truly over, I knew we were ready to face them together. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, pale and hesitant, as if it knew the day ahead would be different. Today was the excursion we had both been anticipating but also dreading. A zipline tour across the nearby forested cliffs. Heights, speed, and trust would be the true tests, not only of courage, but of the bond we were building. We arrived at the base of the cliffs, the scent of pine heavy in the air, mingled with the faint tang of sweat from earlier visitors. The sound of rushing water from a nearby stream filled the silence, competing with the mechanical hum of the zipline harnesses being prepared. He looked at me, a hint of nerves in his eyes, and I could see him measuring whether he trusted me enough to take this leap, not just physically, but emotionally. "You ready?" I asked, keeping my tone light. He hesitated, swallowing hard. "I think so. Yeah, I'm ready." We suited up, the harness snug and secure, the straps digging slightly into shoulders and thighs. I could feel the tension in his body, every muscle coiled, his hands gripping the straps like life depended on it. I didn't rush him. I let him adjust, breathing with the rhythm of his uncertainty. This was more than a physical test. It was a trust exercise, a lesson in responsibility and self-reliance. The first platform was the highest, suspended over the canopy like a small ledge overlooking a sea of green. The guide gave instructions, and my son listened intently, nodding, not joking, not making excuses. He absorbed the directions, and I could see him calculating, preparing, thinking for himself. When it was time to step off, he hesitated. His usual instinct would have been to look at me for reassurance, to ask me to solve his fear. But this time, he didn't. He glanced briefly at me, then straight ahead, took a deep breath, and launched himself forward. The wind roared in his ears, the harness thrumming against his body, and for a moment, he was flying. Not under my control, not depending on my intervention, but on his own courage. I followed immediately, the harness steadying me as I surged into the open air. The thrill was immediate, the adrenaline sharp, and yet there was a clarity I hadn't expected. I wasn't just seeing him succeed. I was witnessing a transformation in motion. Every twist, every sway of the line, every second suspended above the forest was a metaphor for the lessons we had been learning together. Responsibility, trust, independence. At the landing platform, he stumbled slightly, then straightened, laughing breathlessly. That was amazing," he said, eyes sparkling. "I didn't think I could do it, but I did." "You did," I confirmed, smiling. "You handled it on your own. No panic, no asking for help. That's progress." We continued across the remaining zip lines, each run building confidence. He began to relax, even leaning into the rush, discovering joy in the independence he had earned. For me, the triumph was quieter, but just as powerful. I felt pride without exhaustion, satisfaction without obligation, relief without resentment. The lessons we had been practicing, trust, patience, boundaries, were proving real, tangible, and life-changing. After the final run, we walked back through the forest trail, sweat and wind tangled in our hair, the sun warming our damp clothes. Birds called overhead, leaves rustled underfoot, and the faint scent of damp earth reminded me that the world moved on, indifferent to our struggles yet capable of nurturing growth if we paid attention. He looked at me suddenly, serious for the first time all day. "Dad, I know I've messed up before. I've taken a lot from you, more than I realized. I don't want to go back to that. I want to keep this, us, different." I felt a lump in my throat. I reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. "It's already different," I said softly. "And it's because you're choosing to see it that way. Not because I forced it, not because I demanded it. You're stepping into your own strength, and that makes all the difference." We sat on a fallen log near the trailhead, letting the wind dry our clothes and the quiet of the forest settle around us. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The bond between us felt tangible, almost physical, a thread of understanding and respect that had been forged through confrontation, challenge, and choice. I realized that this trip, which had started with frustration and humiliation, had evolved into something far greater, a turning point in how we related, how we trusted, and how we grew together. By the time we returned to the hotel, the city lights flickering on against the evening sky, I knew we had crossed a threshold. The airport debacle, the arguments, the tests, they had all been necessary, but this triumph of courage, trust, and self-awareness was the real victory. Not just for him, but for both of us. As we cleaned up for dinner, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest. He was changing, I was changing, and the relationship we were building was stronger than any frustration, demand, or mistake we had faced. For the first time in years, I could see a path forward, a path where respect, responsibility, and genuine connection replaced entitlement and obligation. The following day was deceptively calm. We had planned a simple excursion, a boat tour around the harbor, a chance to see the city from the water, maybe spot some wildlife. Simple, yes, but for both of us, it was another test. The quiet days of reflection had built confidence, but real challenges often came disguised as routine. The harbor was alive with activity, gulls circling overhead, the scent of salt sharp and clean, mixed with the faint smell of engine oil and fried food from nearby vendors. I could feel the excitement and the undercurrent of nerves in my son's body. He was eager, but there was a subtle tension in the way he carried himself, the kind that had been common before, but now seemed tempered by caution and awareness. We boarded the boat, the deck rocking gently underfoot. Passengers settled into benches, some chatting quietly, others taking photos, and the captain's low, authoritative voice gave instructions over the engine's hum. I watched him scan the crowd, posture straightening, eyes alert but not anxious. He wasn't waiting for me to fix anything. He was assessing the situation himself. As the boat pulled away from the dock, I noticed a small group of tourists standing near the railing, blocking the view of the city skyline. One of them, a man in a large hat, leaned carelessly against my son's arm. In the past, I would have stepped in, diffused the situation, or demanded an apology. Today, I waited, studying how he would handle it. He looked at the man, then back at me, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But instead of panicking, he gently shifted his stance and said, "Excuse me, I'm trying to see over here." His tone was calm, assertive, respectful. The man looked surprised but moved aside. No shouting, no tension, no need for me to intervene. He had done it himself. I exhaled quietly, feeling a surge of pride and relief. The transformation wasn't complete, He wasn't perfect, but the foundation was solid. He had internalized what we had been practicing: self-respect, awareness, and courage, without reliance on me to solve every problem. We spent the next hour moving along the harbor, the boat slicing through the water, waves spraying lightly against the sides. The sun filtered through broken clouds, shimmering across the surface in gold and silver streaks. He pointed out a pair of otters swimming near a dock, laughing softly at their antics. He didn't ask me for snacks or money, didn't demand my attention in a transactional way. He simply shared a moment, inviting me into it. And that small shift, shared joy without expectation, felt monumental. When the boat slowed near a small lighthouse, the captain offered the chance for passengers to climb up and take pictures. The stairs were narrow, steep, and intimidating. My son looked at them and hesitated. In the past, he might have asked me to go first, to lead, or to convince him it was safe. But now he stepped forward, measured each step, and climbed steadily on his own. I followed, close enough to ensure safety but distant enough to let him navigate his own path. At the top, the view stretched for miles. City skyline to one side, forested islands on the other, and the endless expanse of water blending sky and sea. He stood there, wind tugging at his hair, taking it in silently. I noticed a quiet pride in his posture, the same pride I felt mirrored in my chest. This was a milestone, not a grand event, just a quiet, meaningful victory. He had faced uncertainty, taken responsibility, and handled it with grace. On the boat ride back, we sat side by side, the engine's hum and the gentle slap of waves against the hull filling the silence. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't ask for money. He simply existed, engaged with the moment. I realized that the airport, the fights, the arguments, they had all been necessary steps. Without them, this calm, measured connection would have been impossible. By the time we docked, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This trip had become more than a vacation. It had become a crucible for growth, for both of us. He was learning independence, empathy, and respect, not because I forced it, but because he was choosing it. And I, in turn, was learning patience, restraint, and the power of letting go. As we walked back to the hotel through the bustling streets, the air alive with the smell of street food and the chatter of tourists, he bumped my shoulder lightly and grinned. "Thanks for letting me handle that today," he said. "I feel different." I smiled, feeling the warmth of the moment deep in my chest. "Good," I said. "That's exactly how it should feel." And in that simple exchange, I realized that real growth, the kind that sticks, comes from experience, choice, and trust. He was no longer the boy who demanded everything from me. He was becoming someone capable of seeing, understanding, and participating in the world alongside me. That evening, the hotel room felt smaller than usual, though the city lights glittered through the windows like distant stars. We had returned from the harbor, exhausted but satisfied, yet there was a weight in the air I hadn't expected. I could feel it as soon as we walked in. Tension, unspoken and thick, the kind that comes from years of patterns that don't vanish overnight. He dropped his bag and flopped onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. "Dad, can I ask you something?" he said quietly. His voice carried hesitation, the kind that suggested he wasn't sure whether he wanted an answer, or whether he was ready for the truth. "Of course," I replied, sitting in the chair near the window, letting the city lights wash over me. He paused, biting his lip. Why did you let me handle things today? The airport? Everything? I mean, you could have stepped in like you always did. You didn't. Why?" I leaned back, letting the question hang. It was one I had been wrestling with myself for years. The same question I hadn't had the courage to ask him in reverse. Why had he assumed I would always fix everything? I chose my words carefully. "Because I realized something important," I said slowly. "I realized that you weren't learning anything if I did it all for you. And I realized that I wasn't really living if I kept letting myself be drained by constant demands. You needed responsibility, and I needed boundaries. It was time for both of us to grow." He was silent for a long moment, eyes fixed on the ceiling again. Then his shoulders slumped slightly. I didn't realize," he admitted softly. "I didn't mean to. I thought you wanted me to depend on you." I shook my head, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "I love that you rely on me sometimes, but there's a difference between relying and taking advantage. I was tired of being taken for granted. And honestly, you were too. You didn't realize it, but you were stuck in habits that didn't serve either of us." He sat up, running a hand through his hair. "I know. I'm trying to do better. It's hard. I didn't know how to be responsible, I guess, and I didn't know how to respect you without losing what I thought I wanted." His words stumbled out, raw and unpolished, but they carried truth. I felt a lump in my throat. All the moments of frustration, anger, and disappointment came rushing back. The airport, the demands, the times I had quietly given until I felt invisible. But now, hearing him speak honestly, I realized that those moments had been necessary. They had forced confrontation, and confrontation had created change. "You don't have to be perfect," I said softly. "You just have to notice, choose differently, and keep trying. That's all anyone can ask of you. And that's all I've asked." He nodded slowly, his eyes wet but clear. "I want to get it right," he said. "For us. For me." And in that moment I felt the weight of years of tension and miscommunication lift, just a little. It wasn't instant forgiveness, and it wasn't perfect understanding, but it was progress, the kind that matters. I reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder, a quiet acknowledgement of both the struggle and the growth. We sat together in silence for a while, listening to the hum of the city outside, the occasional siren, the distant laughter of people living lives we had temporarily left behind. I realized that this was as important as any excursion, any test of courage or independence. Emotional honesty, shared vulnerability, and mutual respect were the real milestones of our journey. Finally, he leaned back, a small smile breaking through. "Thanks, Dad, for letting me learn." I smiled back, the city lights reflecting in my eyes. "And thank you for letting me teach," without losing myself in the process. As night settled over the city, we talked quietly about nothing and everything. The mundane plans for tomorrow, the sights we wanted to see, memories from home. There were no demands, no expectations, no sense of obligation. Just connection, just understanding. For the first time in years, I felt that the distance between us, the emotional distance, the patterns of entitlement and frustration, was shrinking. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it was manageable. And more importantly, it was reciprocal. We were learning how to navigate each other, how to respect each other, and how to grow together. And that, I realized, was far more valuable than any vacation, any money spent, any lesson taught through frustration. It was the kind of progress that stuck, the kind that would carry forward long after we returned home. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of the ocean mixed with the faint aroma of bakery goods from a nearby cafe. Today was supposed to be easy, a visit to a small amusement park near the coast. The plan was simple: enjoy the rides, take some pictures, and maybe indulge in a few treats. But life has a way of testing you when you least expect it, and today would be no exception. As we approached the entrance, I noticed a line of teenagers running ahead, cutting in front of slower families and jostling anyone who got in their way. My instinct was to step in, to protect my son, to shield him from the chaos. But I stopped myself. I remembered the lessons of the past week: the airport, the trail, the ferry, the zip line. He was learning, and now was the moment to let him apply it. The first jolt of tension came when one of the teenagers accidentally shoved him aside while laughing. I felt my pulse quicken, ready to intervene as I always had. But he didn't react the way he used to. He straightened, caught his balance, and said firmly, "Hey, watch where you're going." His voice carried authority without anger, a boundary drawn calmly but clearly. The teen looked surprised, muttered an apology, and moved along. I exhaled, a quiet sense of pride filling me. This was exactly the kind of moment I had been waiting for. A real test, outside of controlled settings. We spent the morning riding roller coasters, Ferris wheels, and spinning rides that made our stomachs twist with laughter and excitement. He approached every ride with caution, reading the rules, listening to the attendants, and deciding for himself what he was comfortable with. There was no frantic reliance on me to dictate what to do next, no expectation that I would shield him from discomfort. He had learned to navigate both fun and challenge independently. Around midday, the real test arrived. A sudden announcement over the loudspeakers warned of a technical malfunction on one of the larger coasters, the one he had been eyeing all morning. The line was long, and the crowd grew restless, people shouting and complaining. I could feel his hesitation, the old pattern tugging at him. Insist on my intervention, complain, or step aside entirely. Instead, he took a deep breath and scanned the situation. "We can either wait it out or pick something else," he said thoughtfully. "I don't need to ride that one." The decision was calm, measured, independent. No whining, no reliance on me to fix the problem. I nodded, impressed. "Good choice," I said. "Let's find something else you'll enjoy." We spent the next hour exploring smaller rides, playing games at the stalls, and trying our luck at winning prizes. He engaged fully, not demanding constant attention or purchases, not expecting me to fund every whim. He offered to pay for a small plush toy with his own money, a gesture that would have been unimaginable before this trip. When I accepted it, he smiled, genuinely proud of his contribution. Later, we stopped for lunch at a small cafe in the park. He ordered for himself, double-checking the prices, choosing wisely, and even suggesting we split a dish so we could try more. The contrast to previous vacations, where he had expected me to cover everything without thought, was stark. I felt an almost overwhelming sense of accomplishment, not for me, but for him. He was learning responsibility and independence in a real, tangible way. As we left the park, the sun dipping toward the horizon, I reflected on the journey so far. From the airport debacle to this day, each challenge had built on the last, slowly shaping a new dynamic between us. He had learned how to respect boundaries, make choices, and navigate consequences without panic or complaint. And I had learned restraint, patience, and the importance of letting go at the right moment. That evening, as we walked back to the hotel along the quiet streets, I felt a subtle shift in the air between us. There was ease in our conversation, laughter in our shared observations, and, most importantly, mutual respect. The challenges had been hard, sometimes exhausting, but they had produced growth, the kind that was lasting, tangible, and real. He looked at me, eyes reflecting the fading sunlight, and said softly, "Thanks for letting me figure things out on my own." I smiled, feeling the warmth of both pride and relief. "And thank you for stepping up," I replied. "That's how we grow." And in that moment, I knew that the lessons of this trip, accountability, independence, respect, were no longer theoretical. They were lived, experienced, and shared. The bond between us was no longer defined by demands or obligations. It was defined by understanding, choice, and mutual trust. The foundation for a relationship that would continue long after we left this city behind. The next morning, the hotel felt almost serene. The city outside was stirring, but inside, the quiet hum of air conditioning and distant footsteps gave a sense of calm, as if the world had slowed just for us. I knew today would be different. It wasn't about rides, excursions, or tests. It was about reckoning with the past and fully acknowledging the changes we had made. We sat in the small hotel lobby, sipping coffee and watching the streets awaken. He stirred his cup absent-mindedly, eyes tracing the movement of pedestrians. After a long pause, he looked up and said, "Dad, can I be honest about something?" "Of course," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "I've been thinking about the airport," he said, voice quiet but steady. "And everything I did, how I acted. I realize now how selfish I was. I made you feel small, invisible, like your worth was only what you could give me. I'm really sorry." I felt a lump form in my throat. The words were simple, but their weight was enormous. Years of frustration, disappointment, and quiet resentment had built up. And here he was, speaking them aloud without excuses, without deflection. "I forgive you," I said, my voice soft but certain. "It hurt, yes, and it still stings to remember. But what matters is that you see it now, and you're choosing to act differently. That's real growth." He nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I want to do better," he said. "Not just for this trip, but for us. For real." I reached over and put a hand on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of that gesture bridge the gap of years. "That's all I've ever wanted," I said, "for both of us to grow. And today, I think we're finally getting there." We spent the day walking through the city streets, visiting small shops and cafes, sharing quiet conversations that weren't about demands or money, but about life, choices, and shared experiences. Each step felt lighter, freer, as if the weight of past mistakes had been lifted, if only slightly. He laughed at small jokes, helped carry our purchases without being asked, and even offered to pay for a coffee without hesitation. Every gesture, however small, carried meaning. Later we found a quiet park overlooking the water. The sun was low, casting golden light across the grass and trees. We sat on a bench, listening to the distant cries of seagulls and the gentle slap of waves against the pier. I could feel the peace settling between us, the kind that comes from honesty, acknowledgement, and the willingness to change. He turned to me, eyes serious. "Dad, thank you for everything, for not giving up on me even when I made it hard, and for teaching me to see things differently. I don't take that lightly." I smiled, the warmth spreading through me. "You don't have to. You just have to keep practicing it. That's all any of us can do." We sat in silence for a while, letting the calm of the park wash over us. The wind tugged at our clothes, carrying the faint scent of salt and earth. Birds moved through the trees above, landing briefly before taking off again. It was ordinary, yet perfect. A moment free from conflict, free from demands. A moment defined only by understanding and connection. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, I realized how far we had come. From the airport, the arguments, the tests, the lessons learned on trails, ferries, and roller coasters, we had navigated it all, together. Not as parent and child bound by obligation, but as two people capable of mutual respect, understanding, and trust. He reached over, resting his hand on mine briefly. "I feel like this trip really changed us," he said. "It did," I replied, feeling a quiet sense of triumph. "And it's just the beginning. We take this forward, every day." For the first time in years, I felt fully seen and appreciated. Not as a provider, not as someone to solve problems for, but as a man, a father, a partner in this evolving relationship. And I knew that he, too, had begun to see himself differently, capable, responsible, and aware of the impact of his choices. As we walked back toward the hotel, the city lights beginning to blink on one by one, I felt a calm certainty in my chest. The past, with all its mistakes and frustrations, had led us here. And now, standing side by side, I knew we had the tools to face whatever came next. Together, with respect, understanding, and trust firmly at the center of our bond. The next morning, the city was calm, a soft haze settling over the streets as sunlight filtered through. We had planned a final day of exploration, nothing extreme, just wandering through a local market, taking in the sights and smells before returning home. Yet even ordinary days can test what you've learned. As we approached the market, I could feel the familiar hum of excitement mixed with a touch of anxiety in my son. He had grown so much over the past days, yet I knew that habits didn't disappear overnight. The old patterns, the assumptions, the demands, the quick frustrations could resurface if not carefully managed. We entered the market, a lively place full of chatter, colorful stalls, and the rich scent of spices, roasted nuts, and fresh bread. Tourists and locals jostled each other, bargaining for goods and snacks. I could feel the pulse of the market, chaotic yet structured, like life itself. A vendor called out, holding up a brightly painted mask. My son paused, eyes wide. "Dad, can we get that?" he asked, voice tinged with hope. I smiled, testing him gently. "Do you want to pay for it yourself?" He hesitated. For a split second, I saw the old reflex, expecting me to reach for my wallet, to make the decision for him. But then he shook his head, reached into his pocket, and handed over his own money. "Here," he said firmly, "I've got this. I felt a surge of pride. It wasn't about the money. It was about responsibility, about internalizing the lessons of the past week. I took the mask, smiling broadly. Exactly. That's how it's done. We moved through the stalls, sampling small treats and examining handcrafted jewelry. He asked questions, listened carefully to the vendors, and made choices thoughtfully. At one point, a group of rowdy teenagers ran past, knocking his arm and nearly spilling a drink he had just purchased. My first instinct was still there, buried deep, urging me to step in, to protect him as I always had. But I watched him closely, ready to support, but not take over. He steadied himself, adjusted the cup, and said firmly but calmly, "Watch it next time, okay?" The teens barely registered his words before moving on. I exhaled slowly, relief mixing with pride. This was the real test: chaos, unpredictability, and the chance to assert himself without leaning on me. And he had done it, just as he had on the trail, the ferry, the zip line, and at the amusement park. Each moment was a building block, reinforcing lessons that weren't theoretical, but lived. Later, we stopped at a small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the market. He ordered for both of us, checking prices and making sure we had enough for a tip. The attention to detail, the thoughtfulness, the absence of demands, it all struck me like a revelation. He wasn't perfect, but he was fully present, fully engaged, and fully responsible for his choices. As we ate, he looked at me, eyes bright but serious. "Dad, I think I finally get it. I've been thinking about the airport, about everything. I don't want to go back to that person. I want to keep being this." He gestured to himself, a quiet acknowledgement of change. I nodded, my chest tight with emotion. And that's exactly why this trip matters. You've learned that respect, responsibility, and independence aren't just words. They're choices. Choices you make every day, not just when it's easy. By the time we left the market, carrying a few small purchases, the sun was dipping low, casting golden light over the streets. The chaos of earlier had faded into calm. The city smelled of bread, roasted nuts, and the faint tang of the harbor air. I realized that the small tests, the minor challenges, were just as important as the big ones. The airport, the zip line, the roller coasters. They were the moments that cemented lessons, proving that change wasn't fragile, but real. As we walked back to the hotel, he bumped my shoulder lightly and grinned. "Thanks for letting me handle things on my own all week. I feel different, better." I smiled, warmth spreading through me. "And I feel proud. That's the real victory. Not what we saw or bought or did, but how we handled ourselves, together." And in that quiet, ordinary moment, I knew that the patterns of the past had finally shifted. He wasn't just a boy learning responsibility. He was a young man embracing it. And I wasn't just a father giving lessons. I was a man reclaiming himself and discovering the depth of our bond. The morning sun spilled over the city one last time, golden and warm, as if it knew this would be our final day together on this trip. We packed our bags slowly, savoring the rhythm of routine. Clothes folded, souvenirs carefully stowed, and breakfast shared with quiet conversation rather than rushed demands. It felt like a victory in itself, ordinary yet meaningful. We decided to take a short walk before heading to the airport. The streets were calm, the faint smell of fresh bread and coffee in the air, mixed with the occasional tang of salt from the nearby harbor. My son walked beside me, relaxed and steady. The posture, the confidence, the thoughtfulness, it was all there. No entitlement, no need for me to anticipate his next demand, just presence. As we passed a small park, a group of children ran past, chasing a ball, their laughter ringing out across the benches. One tripped and dropped his toy near my son. Without hesitation, he picked it up and handed it back, smiling. "Here, man," he said. No sarcasm, no expectation of thanks. Just a simple act of awareness and kindness. I felt a lump in my throat. This was the boy who had once demanded everything from me, now capable of empathy and self-sufficiency. We stopped at a small cafe tucked into a corner of the street. He ordered for both of us, careful with the menu, thoughtful with the portions, and considerate with the cost. I could see the faint pride in his expression. pride in handling responsibility, pride in contributing. For the first time, our meals, our purchases, our experiences were shared in partnership, not dictated by need or expectation. As we walked back toward the hotel, he paused, glancing up at me with that quiet seriousness that had become familiar over the past days. "Dad, I just want to say thanks for everything, for letting me learn, for letting me fail, for giving me a chance to be different. I don't think I'd get it without you." I smiled, my chest warm with emotion. "And thank you," I said, "for trying, for listening, and for stepping up. That's how change happens. Not because it's easy, but because you choose it." We made our way to the airport, the hum of travelers and announcements filling the space. As we checked in and dropped off our bags, I realized something profound. The fear I had felt at the beginning of the trip, the panic, the frustration, the hurt of being left behind, was replaced now by quiet confidence. Not just in myself, but in him. He had grown. We had both grown. Waiting at the gate, we sat side by side, not reaching for phones or fidgeting, just taking in the moment. He glanced at me and said softly, "I think all of this, changed me. I don't want to go back to being that kid who expected everything from you." "You won't," I replied, feeling the truth of it in my chest. "You've seen the difference it makes to take responsibility, to think before acting, to respect boundaries, and you'll carry that forward." When the boarding call came, we stood together, ready to leave. I felt a sense of pride that went beyond mere parental satisfaction. This wasn't about a trip, or money, or who paid for what. This was about transformation, about trust, about mutual respect forged in real moments, both challenging and ordinary. As we walked onto the plane, I noticed the subtle changes in him, the confidence in his step, the ease in his demeanor, the small acts of thoughtfulness that had become second nature. I felt the same in myself, the sense of reclaiming my own worth, no longer invisible, no longer just a provider, but a man capable of guiding, teaching, and trusting. The flight took off smoothly, the city shrinking beneath us, the coastline blurring into the horizon. He leaned back, eyes half closed, a small, satisfied smile on his face. I glanced at him, feeling the depth of the journey we had shared. It hadn't been about vacations or expenses. It had been about growth, understanding, and finally bridging the gap that had once felt impossible. As the plane leveled out, I reached over and ruffled his hair lightly. "I'm proud of you," I said quietly. He looked at me, eyes bright and steady. "Thanks, Dad. I'm proud of us too." And in that moment, I knew it was true. The trip, the challenges, the arguments, the lessons, they had all led to this. A connection built on respect, responsibility, and love. We had both changed, and the bond between us was stronger than it had ever been. The plane soared above the clouds, and I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet triumph settle in. We were leaving the city, leaving the airport behind, but we were carrying forward something far more valuable: trust, understanding, and the knowledge that we could face whatever came next, together.